Thanks very much for joining this webinar that we're running, and we've timed this obviously to coincide with the fact that in Brazil the COP meeting is about to take place, or is starting very soon. So this we've called this IPCC. What's it all about? And the idea for this came out of a view that I had, and I guess you do too. The IPCC is something we hear about. We see lots of thick reports, but behind all of that is a lot of human stories. Why do people do it? Why do people engage in it? We like to think that it drives policy and impact, but does it? And what's the future of the IPCC process? So we're going to explore these sorts of questions and things like that over the next hour or so. And to help me, I've got four distinguished colleagues: Stephanie Henson from NOC, Alessandro Tagliabue from the University of Liverpool, Peter Landschutzer from Liz, and Sandy Tamala from South Africa. And Peter's just waved. And they're going to introduce themselves in a bit. So let's keep going. So just very quickly, I'm going to moderate this. I'm going to give a few slides just to kind of kick us off. But most of this is going to be the panel talking to each other about some of the questions that we've come up with, but as importantly, kind of talking about some of the questions that you've got. And I'll explain in a minute how the questions are going to work. So we're recording this, and the chat, which is where we'd like you to put your questions, will get turned on when we get to the question part of the program. I'll try and direct the question to the right person, but really we're hoping to have this as a conversation where people can kind of like pick up questions together. And then at the end of the webinar, the chat gets tidied up and we try and answer any questions we didn't have time for, and we post that alongside the video as a sort of, a permanent legacy of this. So you can go back and watch it again, or you can tell your friends about it. So just very quickly, this is being supported by two large projects. One's called OceanICU, which is about the biological pump and what happens to it in the face of climate change. And the other's called TRICUSO, which is a project about how we can best observe the Southern Ocean carbon sink using multiple different technologies. So into the meat of it, why are we doing this? What is it? What actually is it? Is it useful and should it change? So those are the kind of questions that we've structured this around. And here's a sort of super topical slide. The climate crisis is very real. On the right is an image from The Guardian a few days ago. Obviously, information is not the only thing that we need to manage the climate crisis, but it's absolutely integral to it. There's an enormous amount of climate science done, and the IPCC is the major way, or a major way, that massive quantity of research literature that many of us generate gets synthesized together to inform decision making. And it requires an enormous amount of effort from many people around the world. So we just thought that because it's so important, because it's a voluntary process, that people would be interested in understanding how it works. So this is from Wikipedia. What is it? It's an intergovernmental body of the United Nations who specifically mandated to give governments at all levels scientific information. It's set up by WMO, and there's a secretariat. 195 member states, so nearly every country on Earth contributes to it, and member states elect scientists to serve through an assessment cycle of about 6 years. And there's a formal nomination process. There's multiple working groups and a task force. And so when I was preparing for this webinar, I looked for a kind of a summary of it, and I came across this, and I think this is a really, really nice sort of synthesis of the information in the projects as a whole, but also a really nice downscaling regionally into Chile. If you want to know more about the sorts of information that it gives at a local level, then this is kind of worth looking into. But the reports over time have increased in confidence about the causes of the rise in temperature that we see, increased in confidence about the complexity, about the consequences, and gradually over time they've been really, really authoritative and important in shaping our kind of understanding about how the world is changing and what's driving it. Does anybody read it outside government and NGOs and science? I mean, we all read it and kind of like pull quotes out to drive our proposals, but does anybody else read it? On the left is a pretty interesting article by the head of sustainable investment in a big investment fund, and his view is that it is a really important document that people should take notice of. And on the right-hand side is a kind of a synthesis by an organisation that exists to tell people or suggest to people where they invest their money. And their perspective is that the bombshell report was ignored by the stock markets. So I think there's a kind of a sense that we ought to take more notice of it than we do. Should it change? Well, so this was kind of an interesting set of reads. On the left is a suggestion that it's incredibly long, and that the person who wrote the first opening chapter was told to keep it short, something I'm sure we can all sympathise with. And then on the right-hand side is a somewhat controversial piece in the conversation suggesting that it's served its day because we know the climate's changing. So we don't endorse any of these perspectives, obviously, but this sort of stuff, this sort of debate does happen actively. So with that, I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves, and then I'll explain a bit about the panel, about the questioning, and then we'll kind of kick off. So from right to left, Steph, do you want to tell us who you are?
Yes. Hi, everybody. I'm Steph Henson from the National Oceanography Centre in the UK. And I'm a marine biogeochemist. I'm interested in how phytoplankton and the biological carbon pump influence carbon storage in the ocean. And I address that with a combination of observations and models. And my role in the IPCC was that I was a lead author on the assessment report 6, so the one that's finished, in chapter 5, which is about carbon and other biogeochemical cycles and feedbacks. And I elected not to participate in the current AR7 round, which you might want to ask me about. Why not later on?
Sandy, over to you.
Hi, my name is Sandy Tamala. I'm the research group leader of the Southern Ocean Carbon Climate Observatory, which is a research group in South Africa that's hosted by the CSIR. And similar to Steph, I'm also a biogeochemical oceanographer, looking at the role of phytoplankton in driving carbon uptake and storage, primarily through observations and from satellite and autonomous robots. This is my first time in the IPCC, and so I still have a lot to learn, but I'm hoping to get a lot out of it and also to bring some of my sort of skills and knowledge in particular relating to the Southern Ocean and the global biological carbon pump and how it might be changing, and bring those aspects to the IPCC. So yeah, that's me.
Thanks, Andy. Al, do you want to introduce yourself?
I can, Richard. Yeah. Hi, everybody. My name's Alessandro. I'm a professor at the University of Liverpool. I'm another biogeochemical oceanographer. You wait around a long time, and then 3, maybe 4 come along at once. I'm interested in productivity in the ocean and the nutrient cycling that supports it. I was the lead author on the IPCC special report on ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate, which was kind of unusual in that it was a joint Working Group 1 and Working Group 2 report. I then participated in the government approval of the summary for policymakers of that report. I participated as a contributing author on the AR6 cycle main report for Working Group 1 that Steph mentioned. And I'll be a lead author on the upcoming AR7 in Working Group 1 on a chapter which is about process understanding of Earth system changes. Thank you.
Thanks, Al. And then finally, Peter.
Hi, I'm Peter. I'm a research director for Flanders Marine Institute in Ostend in Belgium. I am also a marine biogeochemist, like the rest of the panel. My focus is more on the inorganic carbon cycle, but yeah, I'm also interested in how the ocean sort of contributes to the uptake of man-made carbon dioxide and the fate of that carbon dioxide in the ocean and the consequences of a changing climate. My role in the upcoming IPCC report is also that I will be a lead author, chapter 2 in my case, and I have previous experience from AR6 as contributing author, which will probably be a very different world, but is something I'm curious to find out. Yeah, that's all from my side.
Okay, that's great, thanks. Yeah, it hadn't occurred to me that you're going to get an extremely marine biogeochemical perspective on the world from all of us. So we had a quick brainstorm about the things that we thought might be interesting to talk about. So there's a whole set of questions that we came up with, but we broke them down into 4 sections. Personal reflection, so why are people doing this? What do you get out of it? How long does it take? The process, what do you actually do? How does it work? Do you get a blank sheet of paper? The impact, has it actually, in your judgment, changed anything? And then finally, based on your experience, and of course some of our contributors don't have any experience to date, should we change things at all? Is it too cumbersome? Does it produce consensus? And then the final question, number 16, is where it says, how can you get involved? That's directed to all the people in the audience. We're going to hopefully have some sort of discussion about how the IPCC can kind of draw in skills from people that are not in the formal process at this stage. So what we're going to do is we're going to go deal with these one block at a time. So we'll do the personal reflections stuff first. I anticipate that being quite interesting and probably taking 10 to 15 minutes. And then the others might be a bit shorter. If you want to ask a question, then now is your chance. So we'll ask all of the, I was going to say candidates, not candidates. We'll ask all of the contributors to make a brief sort of opening statement around this, and then we'll go to some questions. And we're hoping that they'll kind of ask each other questions as well, so it's not all me asking questions. So without further ado, we'll go to the personal reflection section. Why did you actually agree to do this? And I don't know who's going to pick that one up. Steph, maybe you've got an interesting perspective because you decided to do it and then not to.
Yeah. So why did I do it? Well, it was very. I didn't mean to. It was accidental. So I got nominated by colleagues to do it, which I knew that they had nominated me, but I was very surprised to be selected because I thought, gosh, there's no way I'm that kind of league of amazing scientists who get selected to work with the IPCC. But once I'd been offered a role, I thought, gosh, this is an amazing opportunity. I really should get involved. Because the IPCC is seen as an extremely influential body on the international stage that helps us set policy around climate and our adaptation and responses to it. And the underpinning science that is assessed during an IPCC, it's the bedrock of how we go about addressing climate change, or at least that's the view of it from the academic world. I did really enjoy it, but it was extremely time consuming. So it took 7 years from beginning to end. We were interrupted by COVID as well. So a lot of the in-person meetings and workshops couldn't take place as planned, which made everything a little bit more difficult. And it over the course of 6 or 7 years, it probably in fits and starts took up, half or 1 day a week over that entire period. There were periods when it was much more intense and periods when it was a bit quieter, but it's fairly consistent. And the reason that I elected not to become an author again in the current AR7 round was just because I found the process quite overwhelming in terms of the amount of time it took to contribute. And I felt like I had to do a really good job because, the community relies on this stuff for saying what it's going to do next in its proposals, but also it's what governments are relying on to try and set climate policy. So I felt quite a heavy responsibility to get it right. And at the moment I've just got so much other stuff that needs my attention and my time. I thought I wouldn't be able to give it what it deserves. So no, this time I'm sitting out.
Thanks, Steph. So I guess for the others, is it too late for them to back out now, based on what you've just said? We can talk about that in a bit. Who wants to go next with something about some different perspective, perhaps?
Or maybe Al, because you've done it several times now.
Yeah, maybe I'll go. Yeah, because I think that was all very interesting from Steph. I also applied by accident the first time. I was stuck on a train going to Edinburgh, and it kind of stopped up in the lowlands, and I just, because you nominate yourself and you fill in a form to the UK government, in our case in the UK, and then the UK I think effectively more or less puts everybody forward who is plausible as a as an author. So I just threw my hat into the ring. And like Steph, I wasn't expecting necessarily to be accepted for it. I think one big difference from when I did it was that it wasn't during a pandemic. And so, when I reflect on all the positive parts of doing it, there are all the things where I think if we weren't able to do the lead author meetings in person, I think I also probably would have had a very different reaction to it, because I think the main reason is to get out of my comfort zone and meet new people working in different areas towards a sort of common endeavor, right? And there's a really positive sort of group dynamic about that. And I feel like if you weren't able to have the lead author meetings in person, I can see that it would be, you'd miss that real positivity from it. I mean, but like Steph, there's a big responsibility as well. So, going into it, let's see. Maybe you need to ask me again, Richard, when it's completed, as to whether it was sensible to do it again. But I'm hoping the good will outweigh the bad, and we won't have another global pandemic, and we can actually get together and, socialize with one another and gain from that sort of shared endeavor as being part of a team, which I think is the really positive part of the process.
Cool. So, well, I've got loads of questions, obviously. There's nobody asked a question in the chat that I've seen anyway. So do get your questions in. Peter or Sandy, do you want to tell us about your journey, as they say?
I'm happy to go next. So my predecessor, who was the research group leader before me, Pedro Montero, was a coordinating lead author on the AR6. So he really suggested that I do put my hats in the ring, but I wasn't going to otherwise, because I was like, I'm not able, I'm not, at that caliber, but he convinced me I was, which was really nice. And again, you don't think you're really going to ever stand a chance, but it was, it's so incredible when you do get that opportunity, in particular for me, because it just has so much meaning behind it. It's a process that I've really looked up to and admired. And, as an ocean climate scientist, there's always this massive crevasse between the science you do and the impact it has in policy in particular and making change. And we're always trying to bridge that gap to find ways to take the science we do into more tangible kind of societal impacts. And for me to be able to be at the table, part of this IPCC process allows me to narrow that gap and to have the feeling like the work and time I'm putting in is really making a difference. A more tangible difference. But also, I mean, for me as well, it was when Pedro retired from being RGL of our research group. We're quite a small research group in South Africa. And I think Pedro being on the IPCC brought a lot of credibility to our research group. And so we're trying to expand our funding of our group into sort of international philanthropic and donor spaces. And I recognized that trying to, I was noticing when we're saying, or, when you advertising all the good stuff you do, like we didn't have that IPCC on there anymore when we lost Pedro or when he retired. So I recognized that there was sort of, it would bring a lot more credibility to our group as well to sort of have my role in the IPCC, and then that might make a bit of a difference. But also on a more personal note, I'm really keen to learn. Like, obviously, I want to bring my best foot forward and do the best I can at this process. But I'm also really looking forward to when I get over the dauntingness and the imposter syndrome and all that stuff. I really, really am hoping to grow and learn and experience so many different integrated pieces of the puzzle. And I'm really looking forward to it. I don't know, you guys are making me nervous about how much work it is, but everybody who understood what the IPCC was about, most of them said, oh, I'm not sure if I should be congratulating you or commiserating, but yeah. Okay,
so that's, I think I'm getting an overall positive message. Peter, are you going to?
I can just agree with what Sandy said, right? I mean, until the moment that you get selected, you sort of just be happy and feel like this is the greatest thing in the world, and then once you get nominated and you tell people about it, they all go like, wow, oi, well, thanks for all the work. Okay, what have I signed up with? but in my case, I would say it's a sort of a sense of responsibility. And so for me, the first IPCC report that I have ever touched or came across was AR4. So it was in 2009. So I was still studying then. It was actually in my master's at the time. And I remember my first academic summer job, where I was sort of essentially 2 or 3 weeks in an academic institute. And I mean, I was sort of an intern, and they were like, what teaching starts soon, let's do Peter prepare our presentations. And so they told me, like, download AR4, figures and then make a PowerPoint presentation. And I mean, as it goes, I mean, I take my job very responsible. So I did it at the time as well. And I looked at all these figures from AR4 and I really liked it. I really was like, I was really drawn into it. And that's when I really, started to, further process a bit what's all in there, and then sort of started to appreciate, the volume of these IPCC reports. And then my next encounter was then during my PhD. It was the time for AR5. And I remember there was at the big auditorium at the University of East Anglia was a talk by Corinne Le Carré and Tim Osborne, who were lead authors at the time. And I remember that it was super interesting because they were like giving like insights on, behind the science, the science, obviously that's what we know, what we see, what we can read, but they were really like also talking about the process behind it, coming from the, from this lead author meetings, and then also from the final approval process actually at the time. That's what they were reporting on. And I found this very interesting, but I found it also very scary because it's sort of a very different world, right? I mean, if it's very different when you write your own, a scientific assessment, a scientific report, or whether we really, go into the realm of, whatever science we produce is then still to be produced, still to be approved, and so on. And so I was also quite curious to learn more about that. And then, yeah, as I said, then in the last round, AR6, I had the chance to sort of, get a little bit of experience from, being a contributing author. And I mean, in the end, it's sort of, I can only claim having contributed to one single paragraph, which sounds like a very little, right? But I remember at the time it was, even for that, was already a lot of work, because there was a lot of discussions, a lot of calls, a lot of back and forth, a lot of how should we show it, how should we phrase it, how should we, phrase it in terms of the right language. So I was almost shocked how a single paragraph can be so much work. And yet I still think it is my responsibility now as climate scientist to contribute to it and to share my knowledge and to do, what I can for this next AR7. So I nominated myself. I've not been nominated, but I was equally surprised that I've been selected, knowing how many great scientists are actually being nominated or nominating themselves every time again.
Wow. So, I mean, I draw loads of things from that, but nobody in the chat's asking any questions. So, right, we've spent. My suggestion is let's go to the next part, and please do add questions because it'll be this is your big chance to ask these 4 imposter syndrome struck scientists about what they do in their daily lives. Okay, so let's go to the process. Get under the hood, find out a bit about the nuts and bolts. What do you actually do? Who wants to take that one?
Yeah,
is it all
start, Richard.
Cocktail parties in glamorous locations? Not for you, Steph.
If only it was lots of cocktail parties. But no, it actually involves reading an enormous amount of literature because the IPCC doesn't do its own research. The role of the authors is to assess the existing evidence in the literature. And so to do that, obviously, you have to be abreast of what's out there. So an enormous amount of reading. I found the meetings where we only managed to do one in person before COVID struck, but that was really great because there's a lot of back and forth. As Peter was saying, for every paragraph, every part of the report, there's a lot of back and forth, a lot of discussion with your co-authors, how to phrase things, the exact details of what should be included and what shouldn't be included. There was a lot of having to trim the report down because you get a word limit. And despite your best efforts, the first drafts are always far too long. So there's a lot of work that goes into just trying to chop it down to a sensible size. But it was, there was a lot of reading, a lot of fielding emails from people in the community contacting me to say, I've just had this paper published. Could you squeeze it into the report somewhere? Which I guess maybe you don't know that that's going to happen if you're a new author.
What did you say?
Well, it depends what it was. Obviously, if somebody's alerted me to something I hadn't seen, that's great. And if it's really relevant and useful and up to date, that's really handy. But sometimes it was a lot of junk. Sometimes it was not something that was going to get included. But no, it was a lot of reading. I would summarize it as.
Okay. Al, what did you do?
Very little. Lots of so I'm not going to just repeat what Steph said. I mean, I think it's the making of the assessment, which I think is big leap that you make when you turn up through the door. And I feel like in retrospect, we wasted an enormous amount of time early on in the process because I actually didn't really have a full and clear understanding of what the kind of end game was of where were we going to get to? And I remember, by the time you get to the third or fourth lead author meeting, you start to realize, okay, this is what's needed, right? And it's these assessments. You're not just writing a lot of text to review. We've learned this about this aspect of the ocean or the Earth system, blah, blah, blah. They've got to be these very clear statements about what we understand. The ocean is warming by a certain amount, and there's all this, the calibrated language that is on the slide, right? So you have to be able to add, your assessment isn't just your statement, it's the sort of the way you use the calibrated language within that statement. So you might say, for instance, the ocean is warming by a number and say you've got high, low confidence, medium confidence, right? So you add this italicized bit of text. Or you might think that you know enough that you can actually be really quantitative and you can use what's called likelihood language, right? And you can use the ocean is very likely to have warmed between X and Y degrees C. And that represents a sort of probabilistic assessment of what we know. And so while you're reading that literature, in theory, you're meant to be sort of balancing the amount of evidence you've got, the amount of agreement amongst the evidence. And then if you're in a position to do so, whether you've got enough kind of quantitative information to actually do some kind of likelihood assessment. And so I think at the end, you really realize that, at the start, you might want to add in things that you think are interesting. But actually, if you can't generate some kind of assessment, it really serves no value in the report because it's the assessments that are particularly strong that get elevated to the executive summary of your chapter. And then those bits that are seen to be particularly strong in the executive summaries of all the chapters end up in the summary for policymakers, which is ultimately the big impact document. So I think, it's that reading and it's figuring out, have you got the tools to make an assessment? And even sometimes identifying what you're missing. Maybe we can't make an assessment because we don't have this kind of information. And then you can cajole, encourage colleagues to write papers because you can only put it in there if it's in a paper. We can't go off and do a bit of research to calculate something. So I think that's an interesting part. And you see this race to submit papers by the literature cutoff date so that they can be included in the report.
We can see this driving framework call. So there's a big call that will open in about middle of next year, where the Commission is actually advertising quite a substantial amount of money to target uncertainties identified in the IPCC, so that presumably to give you more information. We've got a question from the audience, which I think is kind of relevant to this. How do you reconcile this uncertainty with this need for clear messaging? I think you've spoken about that, but it goes, a kind of a follow-up is it your skill and judgment as a scientist that leads to that, or is there some formal way that you can decide what level of certainty to attach to something?
Yeah, I mean, I can have a go at answering that. So it's not necessarily about your skill and judgment as a scientist to make that, when you make that assessment of uncertainty or likelihood language. As Al was just saying, it's the IPCC lays out guidelines about the uncertainty and likelihood. The likelihood actually has quantitative numbers associated with this. 99% certain to happen, 50-50 chance of happening. So there's actual numbers behind that. So if you're unable from the literature to determine what the likelihood of something is, or, how certain we are about something, it doesn't get in because you can't assign it a certainty. There are the sort of high confidence, low confidence statements that are included, although they don't have quantitative numbers underlying them. There is a guideline. Okay, if there's loads of information out there and everybody seems to have consensus about a particular process or something, then you can give it high confidence.
Right.
And otherwise you have to give it low confidence. So it's not really about your own personal, skill in that assessment. It's there is underlying.
And did you find papers that were using this language in the hope of being picked up by the assessment?
Not in the area that I was working in, which is
Right.
on the biological carbon pump. No.
Okay.
But it would make the job of the lead authors much easier if they did.
Yeah. Although every author would put, this is really important. We've got low confidence. We must have more money to address this.
Yeah, I mean, we all think that there's not enough money in our own particular area. But I was thinking more about the 99% thing.
Yeah.
I mean, in principle, for many of the processes we study, you could make a very clear statement around your model results or your diagnostics that, based on this, there is a 99%. And then that's something you could lift out or could be lifted out. And that would make everybody's life easier, I guess.
Yeah, because often you then have to go and recalculate it. That's sometimes the bit of work you might do in the lead author team. So that would be permitted to take this. So I may contact you, Richard, and ask you to send me your model results. And then I have to recalculate them in a common likelihood framework, right? If I want to integrate your results with Stephanie's, with Peter's, and with Sally's.
Okay, that's interesting. So we've got another question, perhaps controversially. Is there any censorship? Are you ever told you can't say something?
No. Were you
I
told,
haven't
Steph?
come across that.
Okay. But what about the acceptance process at the end? Is that out?
No, I want to just say that you can't be policy prescriptive, right? So that's the mantra. You can't prescribe a solution. So the IPCC would always say they're not policy prescriptive. So if you start drifting into sort of saying, and then we should do that, we should enact this action, then you might get pulled back. But censorship, no, unless you went beyond. Censorship's a strong word, but there's the scoping, right? So you may drift into territory that's not in your remit. But the idea that someone would say you can't say this because you're not conforming to some perceived orthodoxy about climate change is not true. That doesn't happen.
So that's really reassuring to hear, because, I mean, so Sandy and Peter, as you're I guess not as experienced as the others, perhaps. Are you still up for it?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to judge. I mean, as as Steph said, on average, half a day, 1 day a week, over 7 years. What does it mean? It's something that it's difficult for me to grab, to feel. How much of a burden will it really be? And I suppose it will come in waves and as it goes. But yeah, I mean, to be honest, when I listen to these conversations like now, and I listen to Stefan, listen to Alessandro talking about the experience, I actually get more interest in doing it because I want to make my own experience. I also want to meet these interesting people who might have very different standpoint on things, or might have very interesting discussions. So I'm really looking forward to that. I'm not thinking yet of the being exhausted because of late nights. But I'm more thinking about the positives. So I'm still up for it. I don't know how long that will last, but for now it's like that.
Great. Sandy?
Yeah, I mean, I must say, it was super big high when and shock when I was selected. But I thought, it's quite a few years. There's a long runway. It'll start slowly, and I already got a shock that it's already quite full on with thinking and reading and understanding and appreciating, and it's already quite like it's all happening, like you're hitting the ground running. But I think the other thing that's I don't know about you guys, but I find I never have time to read in my job in general. And so it's going to be quite nice to almost have, an impetus to be, you have to now, you're going to have to make time to read the literature that's out there, to be on top of your field and broaden your scope. And, I think that I'm going to grow as a researcher a lot by default, by having to, and it's going to up my game. And there's enormous pressure to do well and to do it properly and to do it justice, not only because I really truly believe in the process, but also, you don't want to let the side down. I want to turn up as a female South African at the process and, do right by it and not let anything slide. So I think I'm going to do my best. And I think through that process, I'm hoping to really learn and grow.
Great, thanks. Okay, so let's move quickly on to impact. You've told us that you read a lot of literature, you wrote it down, you extracted kind of certainties, truths, confidence levels, these sorts of things. Are you aware that anybody ever read it other than people in your own user group? Does anybody ever ring you up and ask you about bits of it? Does anybody ever ask you your advice on what they should do about the climate based on what you wrote?
No, is the short answer.
Yeah, the phone wasn't ringing hot afterwards. It's probably a good thing, to be honest.
But then I've got colleagues, co-authors in the chapter so the biological carbon pump, which is the bit that I was working on, is a little bit sort of not in the mainstream media's mind about what climate change is all about, right? So colleagues who are in the same chapter, the carbon chapter, who are working more on the air-sea fluxes end of things, or more on the routes to net zero, irreversibility of our emissions, that kind of thing. So those colleagues who are more at the sort of pointy end from the media's point of view of the whole thing did get a lot more input and feedback.
Peter, you better take your phone off the hook. Sandy, sorry.
Just to comment, again, it's not my perspective because it's not from mine, but I do know that Pedro and Francois Ellingelbrecht, who's another South African who is on this 7th assessment and the 6th. And I know after theirs, the South African government did sort of give him a call and ring them up and go, what do we need to be aware of? And they wrote an opinion piece together. I think it was in the South African Journal of Marine Science, but they did, or it was in a South African journal, but they wrote an opinion piece and they were essentially kind of asked and to do so when when South Africa recognized that they had contributors sitting on the panel. So I think I just know from them that it did sort of happen.
Yeah, and I'm being a little bit facetious when I say no one was interested. I think, there was an event, the Royal Society put on an event where the UK lead authors were involved, and there's no doubt my university was very interested in it and want to wheel that out, as you can imagine, at any possible opportunity. I went to the COP that was in Madrid and participated in a few events, talking about the results. But I do think you do learn what areas of the research that we do really have impact. And when I say impact, I mean with a capital I, right, way beyond our immediate community. So things that we thought we might think as a group of oceanographers are really controversial. It's when you go to the government approval session and you see which parts of the summary for policymakers really raise the hackles of the government representatives. And it is only very few parts of the biological pump didn't raise many hackles. Productivity even doesn't. Oxygen doesn't. Even acidification. It's really where the ocean touches society is where you really start to raise. And it comes back to the question earlier about censorship. The governments. There are certain governments who are not aided, let's say, by having strong statements about climate change mediated by the ocean having negative impacts on society. And that could be through sea level rise, fisheries, destruction of particular habitats. And so they will be trying to downplay the assessment that's in the summary for policymakers, get you to remove it, But on the other hand, you have other governments who are really keen for that to be in there. It was really impressive to see, or interesting for me to see, the small island nations, speaking up a lot about how important it was that there were strong assessments, strong statements around the impact of climate change on the ocean, because that was what they needed as in the front lines against sea level rise or fisheries or coral bleaching or these kinds of things. So I think when you're part of that process, I guess you really see that at the broader scale, this is really important for those countries to be able to point to these UN FCCC reports to sort of bolster the efforts they're trying to undertake to manage and mitigate climate change impacts.
Okay, so actually, whilst you might not have been personally involved in these discussions, it is your perception, or the reality is, that these reports do drive decision making at a local scale as opposed to just the sort of NDC level. How are we going to manage our emissions by country?
I think they do both, Richard. Actually.
Right.
Sorry, go ahead, Peter. Yeah.
No, I was also wanted to say, I mean, when we talk about impact, what we shouldn't forget is also the next generation. The students, for example. I mean, the IPCC reports have been, the main literature on climate change for, generations that are now, studying new study areas like climate change. I mean, when I was studying, there was no study area climate change. I couldn't study climate change because it just didn't exist at universities. There's now this now exists, and these IPCC reports have become the prime literature for them. And indeed, they're not the policymakers; they can't make the fast decision. But we should not forget that this is the next generation, and they will become the leaders of the future. So I think this is we shouldn't forget about that when we talk about impact.
Yeah, Sandy, go on.
Yeah, I think given perhaps some of the perceptions of how much more we would have liked things to change relative to how much they have changed. There can be a sort of a kind of a negative impression of how it isn't making as big an impact as we would have liked, kind of a thing. And I was having this conversation with Pedro, and he had a really nice way of looking at it when you come to impact, is to sort of say, well, imagine a world where it didn't exist. Imagine a world where there was no IPCC, where you had every politician in the room with one science paper from one scientist in their back pocket trying to support their agenda or their argument around carbon and emissions that suited their kind of economical viewpoint for their country. You'd never get anywhere with negotiations, and the fact that the IPCC reports and has this synthesized consensus that everyone's agreed on, and that now the negotiations can happen, makes a huge difference. And these whole industries around renewable energy and others have really been stimulated by these reports. So I think there's a tendency to think, wow, it's not as impactful as we wish. But on the flip side of that coin, when you look at and imagine a world without it, I think it's quite easy to see how it has and will continue to have impact.
The counterfactual is really, really hard to imagine in all sorts of things, but here specifically. What would it have been like if we hadn't done the emissions that we've done? It's easy to say we haven't done anything, but actually we've done loads, but you just don't notice it in some ways. Okay, so look, we've got about 10 or 15 minutes left. I'd like to just kind of go into the changes section, but before we do, there's a question around early career researchers, how they can get involved, how we can grow the next generation of IPCC authors. I guess underlying that is, do you feel that you kind of had enough training, and would it have been beneficial to you if you knew more what you were getting into when you started?
I mean, there is an effort to try and include earlier career researchers within the IPCC. So that's one of the criteria for selecting authors. And there definitely, in my chapter, there were definitely people who were on the early career end. It wasn't just a bunch of old fogies, which was really nice to see. Did we get the kind of training that I think we might have needed? Probably not. It was a case of, certainly not from centrally from the IPCC. There was a lot of chatting to people in corridors, at the lead author meeting, finding out how this all works, what on earth's going on, all that sort of stuff. How do I do this? So that was really valuable. I mean, if we hadn't have been able to have that first lead author meeting in person before COVID struck, it would have been really impossible to get any kind of mentoring from the other people in the chapter. But as it was, there was a lot of sort of over cups of coffee and beers, figuring out from the more experienced people how it all works.
Okay, so they do retain skill within the system.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a balance, right, between, there'll generally be on any given chapter a blend of sort of new authors, early career authors, and folks who've done it before. And Steph's right. I mean, you don't get, unless I've missed it, I don't think there's been any like formal training. There's been a few webinars I haven't attended, but you sort of learn, because everything's so specific in a way to what you're actually dealing with. It will be very hard to provide general training, because the general training ends up being, or the general concepts are so superficial. Yeah, okay, in theory, you can balance the amount of evidence you've got against the agreement of evidence, but how you apply that in specific scenarios where you're relying on data information just from models, or you're relying on information from observations or time series. We often in the ocean, I think we lack the kind of observations you would imagine being super important and useful for this. So you're often having to balance pros and cons of different kinds of data sets, which all have their strengths and weaknesses. So yeah, it is. There's a lot of on-the-job learning and a little bit of trial and error, I think, as well.
Sandy, over to you.
Maybe just to add, it's not early career stuff, but and I don't know how it's going to pan out, but very interestingly, out of the blue, I got an email where I had to fill in a survey, a preparatory survey for IPCC AR7 African authors. So I had to fill out a form that said, where do I think I need help, in what angles, in what aspects, and they were collecting information from all the African authors on the IPCC. I think my understanding would be the intention is to try to make sure that we get the most help and support that we can. So I'm hoping that there's going to be additional resources that are going to be coming my way soon.
We all hope that all the time. Right. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about changes then. I guess this is most relevant to Al and Steph, and they might have different perspectives. What change is needed? What would have induced you to do it again, Steph?
What would induce me to do it again? Well, I have a better perspective now on what's needed. Obviously, having done it once, I would be going into it with my eyes open. So if I did do it again, and I'm not ruling out I would ever do it again. It just wasn't the right time for AR7. But I would be smarter about how I did the work, because I knew I would understand better what was being expected of me and so on. But in terms of the IPCC itself, the reports are just too long. It's just it's 10,000 pages long, the AR7. Nobody's going to read it. Even the chapter that I was involved in, I don't remember how many pages it was in the end, but it's massive. There's no way somebody's going to sit down and read the entire chapter from beginning to end. It's just too much.
But does that matter that nobody reads the whole thing?
No. There are the summaries, which are developed. But if people are only taking the headline messages and not delving into it, is that good enough? Maybe it is.
I think the one concept we haven't spoken about really is this idea of traceability. So I think, yes, no one reads the whole chapter, but it's there to bolster the terse, heavy hitting statement in the executive summary or in the summary for policymakers. If anyone's looked at an executive summary or an SPM, they always point forward, they point backwards to the specific area of the text. So I think that's really important part of what the IPCC does. And it's something I've learned through the process is when you're trying to make a complex assessment, it's difficult to do it perfectly, but you can definitely do it in a traceable way. You can make it very transparent what evidence you've weighed up to lead to the certain conclusion that you've made or the assessment that you've made. And that's very important because it allows new research then to build on that. Otherwise, everyone's got to start from scratch. And so I think they are very long. Totally get that. And I think the IPCC knows about this, right? I think there was a lot of discussion about Working Group 1 in particular. Was there really any need to run through the mill again on the sort of carbon cycle, heat, et cetera, et cetera? And I think they've recognized this in that the chapters for the forthcoming report, there isn't a carbon chapter, for instance. There are much more process-driven thematic chapters, which is going to make it quite challenging for us, I think. Certainly for those of us who are oceanographers, the ocean is now spread across many, many, many different chapters. So, while Sandy and I are on the same chapter, we're not on the same chapter as Peter. And there's a whole lot of other of our colleagues who are, dribbled around over other chapters, and that will be challenging. So I think that will help by having these thematic chapters, but it will make coordination and division of labor. You don't want people repeating things, and you don't want to force consistency, but you certainly want to be aware of where there are disagreements or different approaches being taken.
Okay. Well, I've got loads of questions, but let's just get to the final question that's on the screen now. So we've still got 30 people in the call. So some people have kind of stayed. Presumably, some of them are budding contributors to the IPCC. Would you what words would you say to them around how they can get involved? Do they have a role, or do we just kind of like watch the great and the good kind of produce this document?
No, they definitely have a role. They definitely have a role. And I think my advice, the first thing they can do is just, keep doing their science and write papers about this stuff. Because if it's not written down in a paper, we can't do anything with it. And I think they can review the drafts when the opportunities come up. There'll be others will have other. My own personal plea is that if in the next few years I contact you to ask you to lend your expertise as a contributing author, as Peter did, that's a real way to contribute. You get your name on the report, you can get involved. So you may well get contacted during this, because we are not experts in all aspects of the Earth system. We have to recognize where our expertise is insufficient to make that assessment, and we'll call upon our colleagues to help us in that. So please be receptive to that. So
does that imply that the author list is not yet complete, and that something was added?
The lead authors are complete, but then if you look at a chapter, there'll be the coordinating lead authors, the top dogs, the ones shepherding the chapter. Then there'll be the lead authors, and then there'll be a long list of contributing authors. So you don't get in the citation if that is what you're interested in. So you're not there in the author list for your citation indexes, etc., but you are there in the printed chapter listed. I'm sure Peter will remember he was there, and it's great to see your name there in the list.
Yep, agreed. That's I think it's either way the wrong mindset if you say want to contribute to the IPCC because of citations. I think in general this is not what you should do in science, but yeah, indeed being part of the bigger picture. And as I said, if I can open now the AR6 and in chapter 2 I can find my name, and I'm always very flattered, even though I had a small contribution. So I sort of I would like to second the pledge from Alessandro. If we call you in the next couple of months and years, please be receptive and please help us shape it.
Okay. Great. So there's one question that's just come in, which is, I think, kind of implies that they've enjoyed this webinar. If you confirm, that would be great. But what they're asking about is, can we hear anything more about your experiences as we go along? Do any of you plan to kind of explain the process as it unfolds? Are you allowed to do that? Did you have to get permission to kind of come to this webinar now? There's clearly some sort of interest from the audience online about trying to understand the process, not just at its genesis now, but as it kind of unfolds over the next 6 years. Was that a good interpretation of the question, incidentally?
While you're waiting, I didn't ask for any permission. Maybe I should have done, but I certainly didn't ask. And I don't think I don't recall being bound by some confidentiality agreements previously.
That's good to know. Because we're planning to put this recording on YouTube or something. Anybody else? It's a shame that we can't kind of so they've said yes, exactly. So I kind of got the spirit of their question right. I think there's an appetite to hear more. So they've amplified it a bit. I was wondering on LinkedIn or through more interviews, can you update this network a little bit? There's clearly an appetite to hear more about it.
Well,
I guess you have to say yes, really, don't you?
I mean, of course, I don't see why not, right? If people are interested, then, I mean, there might be some interesting moments, like when the first order draft is produced, right, for review. That might be some point, or after the author the lead author meetings. I guess it's picking the right time to have those.
Okay, well, that would be great.
The audience.
So some of these projects that we've got do run for another few years, so we can certainly come back to this group at an appropriate time and run a repeat if you're willing to do it and if the audience would like to hear about it. Okay, so I think we've managed to get to the end of our questions, and to my surprise, it's exactly on the hour. Normally these things are a bit shorter, but we've still got our core audience. I don't think there's time for any more questions. There was a "thank you so much" comment in the chat, so that's right. So that's nice. Thank you. But I'd like to thank all of the panelists for kind of coming along, participating, unpacking a bit what's going on, sharing some of their personal thoughts and motivations. I found it really, really stimulating, and I just wish I was kind of involved a bit as well. But I'll try and do that reviewing for it this time, Steph. There was a comment at one stage in the past. I was invited to, well, everybody was invited to comment on the final draft, and I opened it and I thought, this is just a truly fabulous piece of work, and I couldn't think of anything to write, so I didn't write anything. But with hindsight, I wish I had, because everybody likes a few nice words now and again, and maybe it kind of gives them a bit of confidence that what they've said is good. So that's another way that you can get involved at various stages in the process, kind of like commenting on the drafts. So with that, does any of the panelists want to say anything before we call it a day? Thank you so much, and we'll see you again in a couple of years.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.